Hello! Welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast, where we dive into the connection between the land, the sea, and us. Here, field stories reign supreme and life experiences are divulged. I'm your host, Kara Muzia. Let's dive into today's episode. Have you heard about my free program, Back to Nature? Getting outside is vital to our health and the health of our planet. The cool part is, to reap the benefits, you only need a few minutes a day. This course is designed to be fun and easy to do, and perhaps spark an adventure or two. Click the link in the show notes to get started today, or visit karagracemuzia.com. Hello, mermaids, pirates, ocean lovers, and land lovers. Welcome to today's show. Question: where does seaweed or algae go to look for a job? The kelp wanted section. What washes up on very small beaches? Microwaves. Alan Weisman is an award-winning journalist whose reports have appeared in national outlets, including the Atlantic Monthly and NPR, among others. Alan has reported from more than 60 countries, all 7 continents, has written 7 books, several of which have won awards. On the show today, we chat about the original Garden of Eden, what it takes to travel the world as a journalist, the importance of following the breadcrumbs of your own passion, and the reality of not just the book, but also the very vital concept that hope dies last. Please enjoy. Alan, welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Thank you so much. This is going to be fun.
It is. I want to start off with, could you please tell us who El Jefe is and the importance of him in North America?
Well, El Jefe was, and still is, a jaguar. I say was because this jaguar I think it's been about 12 years ago now, appeared on camera traps in the United States, in the state of Arizona. And there had been no jaguars really in the state of Arizona since 1963. There used to be a bounty on them, and the United States wanted them extirpated because they were considered a varmint that would go after valuable cattle. But a couple of them started appearing again in the 1990s, and El Jefe showed up in the Santa Rita Mountains, which, if you've ever been at Sun and you look south, you see these, it's almost like a cartoon of silhouetted peaks. And those are the Santa Ritas. And El Jefe was seen roaming around there, spectacular young jaguar. The area that he was running was scheduled to be one of I think it was going to be the 3rd biggest open pit copper mine in the United States. Many people in Arizona were up in arms against this thing. And it's a long, complicated story that I ended up writing about a couple of times, and it's in my new book, Hope Dies Last, about how his presence in this area was the centerpiece for a lawsuit that was brought by the Center for Biological Diversity and several indigenous tribes, and I think a couple of other environmental groups, might have been defenders of wildlife. But the idea was that this was critical habitat because young male jaguars roam 100 miles or so away from their breeding areas. And the northernmost breeding area for jaguars in New Mexico is in the state of Sonora, just south of Arizona. And they used to exist all the way up to the Grand Canyon, and now they were coming back. And eventually, after a lot of court time, a judge sided with the jaguar. And El Jefe was there, and he continued to be there, and then he was gone. And that was even before the case was decided. But they know that after a young male jaguar spends a few years gaining muscle, gaining strength, being on his own, eating game, then he goes back to the breeding area and can take his place alongside the alpha males. And just recently, El Jefe was seen on camera traps back in Mexico. Now, the important thing about that means El Jefe and other jaguars who are coming in the other direction are finding their way underneath Trump's wall or around it.
It is quite a story. What really struck me was I had no idea that there were jaguars in the continental US. I just assumed them with the jungles of South America. And when I read that there was historically jaguars and still jaguars here, I was completely mind blown. So thank you
Yeah.
for researching that and bringing that to light.
Yeah, they're very hard to see, but one night when I was camped down in Mexico in the Sierra Madre and their breeding grounds, where there were fresh jaguar tracks around, I got up just before dawn, got out of my tent, and I heard a sound that's unmistakable because this is the only animal in the Americas that roars.
The goosebump moment.
I was in earshot, yes.
So growing up, I read that your first book was Audubon Society's Bird Book. And how did that influence, being outside, influence where you are today? Could you talk a little bit about?
You know, I'm looking around. I had the copy in my hands just a few minutes ago, but I was 6 years old. You know, it was huge. I grew up outside of Minneapolis in a suburb, but a lot of that suburb had not been developed yet. And there was this big, what today is elegantly called a wetland, but we just called it the swamp. And it was right next to my house. And there was all this incredible wildlife out there, especially birds, just this beautiful colorful pageant whizzing past my eyes all the time. And my dad, who fought in World War II, had brought back these big, heavy German binoculars. And I used to lug those things out into the swamp with that book. And I used to watch blue-winged teals and coots and grebes and well, it's a long list, but that's where I developed my love of nature. I was just ravished by nature.
What made you decide, one, to go to college, and why didn't you study natural sciences since you were so drawn to it?
Well, I had planned to be a scientist. I wasn't sure which scientist I was going to be because I went from ornithology, then I discovered astronomy, and then I discovered paleontology, and there were all these things I wanted. And then I got into eighth grade, and there was the science teacher who hated me and the English teacher who loves me. And, you know, puberty, the insecurities are crazy. Rejection is just awful. And anyone who encourages you, you just clutch them. So I ended up becoming an English major. I also loved reading and I loved literature, but I never lost my love of science. And I wasn't, I mean, what do you do with an English major? Become an English professor. And frankly, my professors, the only interesting thing about them was the stuff that they gave me to read. I didn't want to become like them. A couple of my roommates were going to law school, and I thought, well, maybe I'll become a radical lawyer. So I ended up going to University of California, Berkeley Law School, where a lot of radical lawyers, it was kind of a breeding ground for them. I lasted almost an entire 3 months. Law school was not the place for me. So I went back to my alma mater, Northwestern, which had prominent journalism school, talked my way into a work-study fellowship, and I wasn't really a very attentive student, but there was one class, a science writing class, that really got to me because it was talking about stuff that I love. And can I tell you about the one assignment in that class that really kind of just,
Yeah, please.
it really proved so valuable when I became a journalist? Is that we had to go to Northwestern's Technological Institute and attend these daily scientific colloquia. And it would be a couple of scientists arguing over something really arcane. I remember the cross section of a fly's eye was one of them, or a few molecules, or something like that. And the assignment was to listen long enough till we understood what the hell they were talking about, and also figure out why should a reader care about this, what matters, which meant I had to interview the scientist and get them to spend their precious time, talking to this journalism student. What I learned was that I could get them to talk to me if at first I didn't just say, thank you, Mr. Scientist. I really want to know about this molecule that you are an expert in and all that. But if instead of jumping right into that, I would say first, but before we start could you tell me, like, how did you get interested in this thing? In fact, how did you become a scientist in the first place? And then I would get this story about when they were a kid and they were out there in the seashore and they saw this thing and suddenly, oh my God, isn't that interesting? And you would get this story about just how they developed this passion. And of course, because everybody's most important story in the world is themselves. Since I'm interested in themselves, they warm to me and they're telling me. But as they reveal their passion, and oftentimes I would see tears and all this stuff, not only did they start to explain to me very, very patiently, but they gave me a story that I could use to get my readers excited, because readers, being people, will follow another person anywhere, particularly when passion's involved. They want to see what makes them just feel so strongly about something and why. And that's how you get to not just what the science is, but why it's important.
Yeah. Tapping into people's passions and really what makes them tick. And most scientists do. They get into it for a very specific personal reason. And a story is so powerful. Their story, so powerful way to tell it.
Yeah. No, I remember the great population scientist, Paul Ehrlich, just telling me, 16 years old, he's at some summer camp, and suddenly he's following this butterfly and he just can't stop, and the next thing, he's reading books on entomology, and he followed his passion to the greatest butterfly entomologist, who was at the University of Kansas, and that's where Paul got his PhD, and ended up being really one of the greatest ecologists of our time. Yeah.
Following the breadcrumbs. I've been talking to a lot of people about that, and people have inklings of what they want to do and then let things kind of get in their way, or life happens or whatever. And it's really interesting to see when people actually put all that aside and you're like, no, let's follow the trail. What comes from that?
Yeah. And life keeps happening. You just have to
Right.
drag it along with you.
Right. Yeah. Right. Life always happens. You had a really fun quote when I was researching you. It said, you couldn't decide what you wanted to do. So journalism was perfect because you get to poke your nose into what everyone else is doing and share it with them for that moment. And I thought that was a really great way to describe what you do.
Yeah. I mean, basically, I've never had to stop going to school. I study all this new stuff and keep learning all my life. Every one of my books has, I mean, this book, I don't know if you've seen the hardcover, but it's the bibliography makes it like about an inch thick. And thank you. There's just so much to learn, but it's not just reading all that stuff. It took an extra 2 years to do this book because my books are always researched in the field. And I've gone to over 60 countries, and just my last three books alone there was some repetition in there, but probably close to 40 countries. This one, I went to 12 countries, and that's just the best part of the work. Just getting to go and vicariously follow these people around and become a part of it for a while. It's just an extraordinary experience.
So
Extraordinary experience, yeah.
this is your seventh book, and I really am curious. I feel like your first one was The World Without Us, right? And
Well, that wasn't my first book.
no, I'm sorry. Your
That was like
first, that was your fourth book, right?
or fifth.
Fourth
Who's
book.
counting?
So
But,
my
but
question was, I feel like that was the first real big toe that you've dipped into, asking this giant question of humanity and how we're affecting the planet. What inspired kind of looking at that big scale?
well, my previous books had looked at those questions, but they were a smaller scale. Like I did a book along the U.S.-Mexico border,
Mhm.
and it's not just the question of like, why is this border so divisive? But, why is one country so rich and one country so poor, and they're neighbors? And why is one country using so many resources? Another country is the epitome of recycling. In Mexico, everything gets fixed. They just use it over and over again. So those questions were already in my head. They'd been nestled in there. I did another book, Gaviotas, set in Colombia, about what became a model village in appropriate technology to the developing world. And it was amazing. They came up with all these incredible things like this solar collectors that worked in the rain and all this stuff because they were out in a very remote region. They didn't have any infrastructure, but they were also surrounded by both the civil war and the drug wars of Colombia. So they were beset by these world tensions. So following that book, that's when I started thinking, I also got a lot of magazine assignments that were taking me to both poles. I saw one melting. I saw an ozone hole over another one. I was at Chernobyl. I saw, the biggest man-made environmental disaster. I was in burning rainforests. And I was just getting this global picture that I really wanted to explain to readers. But because it's global, it's complex, and it needed to be in a book. So for The World Without Us, the challenge was, if I was going to write that book, how could I write a book that wasn't going to just be read by people who already are aware of these environmental questions? I don't want to be just preaching to the choir. As a journalist, the job description is reach the widest audience possible. So for that book, realizing that the reason a lot of people don't read environmental books is because they're usually depressing or scary, or they feel moralistic, like we better change our ways, otherwise we're all going to die. So in The World Without Us, in just a paragraph, I just killed us off right at the beginning. Uh, I imagined that something like space aliens raptured us away, or then this was very prescient. I didn't realize it at the time that a Homo sapiens specific virus picked us off. So they had just done a 15th year anniversary edition of that book when the pandemic hit. So suddenly, there I am again. Everybody's buying the book. But the whole idea of that was, what would happen if we disappeared and all the pressures that we put on the planet suddenly stop at that moment? I mean, obviously some things would be left, like the carbon dioxide that we've already spit up into the atmosphere. But it was extraordinary to find out through my research that nature recovers really swiftly. And, I went to some places like the Korean DMZ or an abandoned village in Cyprus where nature has just taken over everything. Chernobyl is another example. What I hoped is that readers would take away from that, wow, what a beautiful picture. Is there a way that we can add ourselves back to it without being in, constant combat with the rest of nature? Then that led to my subsequent books, including the one that we're talking about right today, Hope Dies Last. How can we have a world still with us?
I saw in another interview that you had spoken with some religious leaders in interviewing. I mean, for this book, there was definitely some references to the Bible, and in your other books, you spoke with other religious leaders. And across, various spiritualities and religions and doctrines, there was this prevailing thought of, you take care of your body in order to let spirit come in and, be with you, and you take care of the temple, the church, the synagogue, whatever it is that you worship in, for the same reason, so that God can be present. And why wouldn't you take care of the earth the same way? Because that's how creation was. That's how it came to be. We were given this beautiful Eden in many religions, in some religions, to take care of. So I thought that was a really beautiful way to look at it.
Yeah. So, I don't know if I'm a religious person particularly. I was born into one that I don't observe now, but I do know that probably 90% of my readers believe in something, whether it's a traditional religion or something else. And I have learned that when you write a book, particularly a nonfiction book, that's based on science, or it's based on the reality of the environment, which is, we are all part of it. It's going to raise questions in a reader's mind that you have to touch at one point. So that's why I always invariably have some religious note in my books. And in this one, Hope Dies Last, I actually start the book at the top of the Persian Gulf, which is not just where Mesopotamia started, the oldest cradle of civilization on Earth, but it's also where archaeologists believe was the biblical Garden of Eden. In Genesis, it describes the meeting place of four rivers, and two of it names the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the other two are ancient names that seem to referred to this wadi that comes up through Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and the Karun River that comes down through the Zagros Mountains in Iran. And they all come together in what would have been this magnificent river delta, which would have been a paradise to our hunter-gatherer forebears. But also, because when you read Genesis, I mean, the creation doesn't sound like what science tells us 13.6 billion years ago, this loud Big Bang. But to me, Genesis reads like the beginning or the end of the Pleistocene. I mean, we were hunter-gatherers. The seas were about 300 feet lower, at least, because all the moisture was locked up in these huge ice sheets. So that top of the Persian Gulf, all of that would have been this long extended river delta, and there must have been so much to hunt and to gather out there. But as we kept doing it, sometimes we'd find that the handful of seeds that we gathered, if we spilled some, oh, look, they sprout right there conveniently. And then we learned that we could capture some of these game rather than kill them out there, haul them in, make a corral out of vines and trees, and then eat them at our leisure. And oh, they keep breeding in there. So suddenly, and this happens in Genesis too. In Genesis 1, where God gives us all this stuff, and but to gather. But in Genesis 2, suddenly we are tillers of the land and stewards of these animals. This to me is exactly what happened in prehistory. But at the same time that all that was happening, then these ice sheets were receding and the seas started rising. So every generation was having to move several kilometers. And this is where in the Sumerian country, I mean, not only do we get the stories in Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian literature, basically sound a lot like the Garden of Eden in the Judeo-Christian Bible, but we get this flood story. And, that's no coincidence. Yeah.
I'm always curious. I don't have a lot of, experience or lens into the journalistic world, and to travel as much as you have and to meet all of these people, I'm really curious, like, how that happens. Like, are you getting funded for some of the journalistic trips that you've taken and asking these questions? Like, what does that look like?
Well, in terms of the funding, I have to write a really good book proposal that oftentimes springs from a magazine article that I've written, that I've already written this thing and I've learned how to write it in such a way that some editor has said, yeah, this will work, and they've published it. So I will use that and maybe another sample chapter or so, just so they can see what the writing style is, and then an outline of where I think this thing is going to go and what it's all about. Now, as that has worked for me more and more, my proposals don't have to be as elaborate because they know my previous books. So my agents sell this idea, I get an advance, and I live off of that advance. Now that gets a little precarious. In fact, I started to say this before, that this book was extended a couple of years because this pandemic happened. And my editor and I would get on the phone every week. We would talk. And we were trying to figure out a way that I could do the book without traveling to all these places. Ultimately, I mean, he loves my work because I go out there and I witness it. And, over Zoom, you just can't smell. You can't get all the tactile impressions. You only get, like behind you right now, I'm seeing just a couple of things that I can barely discern that give me a sense of who you are. Whereas when you're with a person in their environment, then you really, really feel their place and what makes them who they are. So anyhow, we ended up, uh, waiting the thing out. Let's wait a little longer. Maybe this thing will calm down. But once the first vaccination was ready, I was going again. So once I have this book proposal and I'm off going, then I panic and I figure, okay, where do I really have to go? Because oftentimes you put stuff in the proposal that doesn't end up in the book. You just sort of embellishes the proposal, like this guy has an idea of where he wants to go. But I go to at least one of those places that I know has got to be in the book. And I start telling them, here's what I'm researching. And they start giving me ideas. They say, well, have you thought about this? Or have you talked to him or her? Then one place leads me to another. A very early chapter in this book. It's not early in where it ended up being situated in the book. It's set along the Mesoamerican Reef, which It's the world's second longest after the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It runs from the top of the Yucatan down past Belize and Guatemala and over northern Honduras. I was down there with a bunch of scientists from Stanford and from the World Wildlife Foundation and two NASA modelers, and they were talking to coastal managers and park refuge managers and all these people who try to maintain the environment, both the human environment and the marine environment, intact, and how they're going to be able to do that during these times in which shorelines are now shrinking and seas are now encroaching. And I followed those NASA modelers later to Goddard Space Headquarters, NASA Goddard in New York City, which is in that building that everybody sees at the beginning of Seinfeld because of Tom's Restaurant. Jim Hansen, the great climatologist, first scientist to warn the world that we really had a problem with global warming. Anyhow, I was up there and just talking with the people up there, I realized how New York City had been, this is in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, and how they'd been working with the Dutch to try to figure out, how to not drown. And then I found out that the Dutch were talking to everybody, virtually everybody, every country. So I ended up doing a chapter in the Netherlands. And then I ended up following the Dutch guy who had the contract for the entire country of Bangladesh, which is trying to do with the Netherlands. Netherlands is kind of the drain of Europe. It's where the Rhine and the Meuse go, and that's why it's all a delta, or two-thirds of it's a delta. Bangladesh is that to Asia, only 4 times bigger, with these huge rivers that come pounding down from the Himalayas. And these became two really engrossing chapters in my book that also helped tie the book together, this through line of all these places, because we all live on one planet. That's all tied together.
Yep, that's very true. I shared the Netherlands story with my husband, who is an engineer, and he's focused a lot on stormwater, and he's part of some climate resilience coalitions. And so I was like, have you heard of this? Like this guy and the Dutch? And he's like, yeah, they're like the world leaders and keeping water out. Okay. So it was really fun to kind of chat with him about it and see that in your book as well and have that through line. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great that you did that, and yeah, they're amazing. I mean, even the last trip that I made for this book, which was to the Marshall Islands, they're talking to the Dutch. The Dutch, it's all about river deltas and meeting the sea. There are no deltas in the Marshall Islands, but
Right. It's hard to tell people something that we just already talked about just now about the sea levels rising back in the day, hundreds, thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, and people had to move. And there's a correspondence to today. People are having to move. And I had seen some islands off the coast of the United States that are like slowly disappearing. I've seen that firsthand. But it's really striking to know that people are already moving and and this is like a very imminent thing. And even the people in the Netherlands who are actively involved are telling their children, get out before you're a refugee.
Yeah. You probably saw in the book at one point, I think it's just a whole paragraph of all the world financial capitals that are coastal cities. I mean, you start thinking about it, Shanghai, New York, Mumbai, Singapore, uh, it's Buenos Aires. I mean, it's a really long list. Something is going to have to happen. So, I do end up in one chapter that talks about the future of urbanity. I call it The Tale of Three Cities. I went to three really interesting, really different places. But one of them, the city of Busan, Korea, that's where all of our Samsungs and our LGs and our Hyundais come through their port. They are right now embarking on building the first floating city, a city that instead of being engulfed by the seas will rise with it. Um, the woman who's directing that project says, look, 70% of the world are seas, and that's the next frontier. It's not Mars.
Yeah, and that's something I've talked about on the show before. The sea we've barely tapped into what she holds in all of her mysteries. So, and I don't know if we ever will. It's too much. There's a lot there.
Well, I've got two more chapters in this book that talk about, growing food from the sea.
Yes, yes.
Right now that stuff is kind of fringe, but fringe stuff ends up moving towards the center. And particularly as, when foodstuffs get scarce, stuff starts moving to the center of the plate as we learn to, conserve what still is around or take advantage of some of the stuff that we haven't before. You're a marine biologist. I learned doing this book that there's over 12,000 species of seaweed, and they're all edible. And we eat like about six of them, mostly for sushi. So there's a lot more we could and probably will be doing.
Yeah. Yes, I've talked to seaweed farmers on the show before, and that's been really heartening. And a lot of them are the cold water species of kelp. But you talked about an eelgrass species, is Zostera maritima. Again, my husband we're currently working for a restoration company, and that's what they're putting in is it's not Zostera, it's Vallisneria maritima, but it's a type of eelgrass as well.
Oh,
Uh,
that does my heart good. Thank you for me.
yeah, so that was it was really fun to see that. And I was like, did you know that people are like eating the seeds and they're making weed, like making food out of it? And he's like, no, I didn't know that. I'm like, they are.
Well, it's in that chapter, which starts on the coast of Sonora, Mexico, where the Seri Indians, also known in their own language as the Comcac, but it's hard for us to say that in a sentence that flows in English, so everybody calls them the Seris. They don't mind. They are incredible sailors because they live in the the Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California, which has some of the most powerful currents. It's very, very tidal. The Colorado River runs in on one end. It's narrow, and they would make these boats out of reeds and go out there and hunt sea turtles. And the place where you find the green sea turtle, which was their favorite because it had both nutritious meat and medicinal oils, was where eelgrass grows. And their eelgrass, and it seems to be the only stand that anyone knows of so far, but doesn't mean it's the only one. It turns out that eelgrass can propagate both through, was it rhizomes under, it, but also it has a grain. And the Seris were aware of this. So the eelgrass where they are, when it matures, it kind of separates itself from the ground and just becomes a sort of waterborne tumbleweed. And coming in from the hunt, they would push these huge, they look like a wave of eelgrass. I've seen this, in front of their boats. And the women would go out and wade out to catch it before it got all sandy. And then they would put it on top of hides. And then they would do what everybody has done with any grain. They would winnow it and they would eventually separate the grain from the plant. And the Seris would make like a flatbread out of it, or they would mash it up and combine it with honey or turtle oil. And they would make these very nutritious balls that the hunter could take with them out. So a restaurant in Spain uh, on the Bay of Cadiz, that's the bay that Columbus sailed from for the Americas, southwestern Spain, which also has eelgrass. Eelgrass is found throughout the world and happened to be the same species, only a different subspecies. The restaurateur is this very creative guy and very progressive in our sense of how we really think that you should eat. His idea, when you bring in the net from a catch, you use everything in that net. There's no such thing as bycatch that you toss away after it's dead on the ship. You use everything. And you don't just use the fillet of the fish. You use every part of it. So he learned how to make these incredible things out of fish eyes and fish bones and fish scales. And he was from that area. He had worked in restaurants all over the world. His name is Angel Leon. Wanted his own restaurant, and he wanted it in his own hometown so he would help the economy. It was a very impoverished town, and ended up earning 2 and now 3 Michelin stars. He almost went bankrupt because people say, what, we're eating junk fish? But he does these incredible things with seafood. He even has recipes for plankton. He has recipes for bioluminescent soup. I mean, this guy is very creative. But in eelgrass grain, he was wondering, wow, could there be another grain besides rice, corn, and wheat that humans could harvest without banging the land any further, without clearing more of the Amazon to grow? Could we grow it right in the seas? So he and the Seri Indians, there's an encounter midwife through one of America's greatest ethnobotanists, Gary Paul Nabhan, and his wife is also an ethnobotanist, Lori Monty. And I mean, we'd have to read the whole chapter. It's such a wonderful story.
It is a great story. I do love that. And it's feeding us and sequestering carbon down into the soil, because seagrass doesn't just keep the carbon in their leaves. It actually injects it back down into the ground, which is great, which is what's needed. So I want to do a quick little visual for everybody that didn't see earlier, because this is going to go on video as well. The book is Hope Dies Last, and I thought it was such an appropriate title. And one of the ways, or one of the things that struck me when I'm reading your book, is that you're not in it. I was like, did he actually go to these places, or is he just kind of like making up stories as he goes? But no, it's told, as if you were a fly on the wall and kind of watching everybody do their thing, and you're actually there, but you kind of left yourself out of the story. And I thought that was a really interesting way to do it.
One of my early books, I referred to it before, La Frontera. When I turned in the first draft of a couple of chapters, the editor turned it back to me, and he had drawn a line through everything where I was referring to my intrepid journey over the border and meeting drug dealers personally and all this stuff. And at first, I'm furious and I'm offended. But then I see how, without me there, all these other characters who are the main characters, they really pop into life. So I've learned to write that way. I'm kind of an unseen presence, but oftentimes it's also made me a much better listener, because the dialogue that you hear in there are actually these people in my chapters talking to each other. So you get what novelists get. You get dialogue. And, I've learned really to write from two sources: from the ecologists that I've followed into the world that shows me how everything's connected. And I've learned to connect things for my readers because it's so interesting. And so that's how it happens. But I've also learned that you tell a great story. So I read fiction constantly. I call it taking my narrative vitamins, so I can learn how you combine dialogue and history and, compressed and action and I don't have to be there taking up space from these main characters.
It was a good way to write it. It did bring the stories to the forefront, and it made me wonder. I'm like, so is he actually here? There's no way he's getting this much detail without actually being there.
I want to emphasize, though, for other writers who might be tuning in here, is that writing in first person, it's the easiest way because we live our lives in first person. But sometimes it's the very appropriate way to write. And some writers are really great about establishing themselves, like Michael Pollan, for example. Mm-hmm. He's in the book, but he stays out of the way. Possibly, I don't know. I just want to inflate my ego too much when I'm writing. So it's better that I don't do it. But there are no rules in writing. The only rule is it's got to work, and whatever works for you.
Great advice. So at the end of each episode, I have a series of questions that I like to ask. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Alrighty. So again, appropriate for the title of your book of Hope Dies Last. How do you keep the hope?
Well, this book is about my concern of environmental problems that have now reached the level of being really existential problems. The runaway climate. Is there a way that we can possibly reel it back in, or at least slow it down enough so we can adapt to it, so we can continue on this planet? The loss of species. We are in now what's being called a major extinction event. Scientists cannot keep count of how fast we're losing species. We co-evolved with every creature and plant and microbe on this planet. And if we're losing them that we don't even realize, at some point, we could end up being one of the losses. Now, Every species eventually goes extinct, just like everybody eventually dies, but I'm not ready for mine to go extinct just yet. I would like to see us be able to reestablish equilibrium in this ecosystem so we and these other species could go on. But we're really hitting a danger point. And a third existential problem is that can we possibly raise enough food to feed yet another 2 billion of us who are expected by the middle of this century without damaging the planet further? Because the way we grow food right now, by force feeding it with chemistry, our nitrogen fertilizers and lots of herbicides and pesticides, that's the main driver. That, along with plowing more of the Amazon and mowing down other forests, that's the main driver of species loss. And our agriculture overall is a contributor of 1/3 of all the greenhouse gases. So I was dealing with that issue, and I set out to find people who were trying to deal with it actively. And what I found in country after country is people who are incredibly brilliant, ingenious, creative, and stubborn who just refuse to give up. They don't sit around waiting for miracles to happen. They try to make them happen. And some of them do some pretty miraculous things in this book. And by the end of it, I was very uplifted. And I realized that as long as we make hope an active verb and we keep doing something, then yeah, my hopes do not die. They're not ready to die yet.
What are some things that you bring into your everyday life or some actions that maybe it'd be a result of what you've learned in researching, not just this book, but the last, I mean, it seems like all your books have a theme here.
Yeah. Well, one is that except for one brief passage through Tucson, which is not a bad place to be. You can escape it pretty fast, but I always live out in nature. And I'm surrounded by forests where I live here. And that's really, really vital to me because writing is partly these great research trips, but a lot of it is just sitting in the chair where I am right now. And if I could not replenish my soul every day in nature, but my house runs on solar energy. The other than the wood stove, everything else is a heat pump in this house that provides warmth. And last year, for the very first time, it was really nice to have that air conditioning option that you get on a mini split heat pump. Our cars plug in, and we grow a lot of our own food. My wife is probably in the garden right now. She's an artist, and her art is another thing that replenishes me, by the way. I always advise people. I was asked recently when I was giving one of my book tour talks, when someone says, what can we do in our daily lives? And one thing is, find a child. It could be your own child. It could be your grandchild. It could be any child. Take that child out into nature. You may have to haul them away from their glowing screen, but once they're there, after grumbling for a little while, they'll see something interesting. And they'll ask you about it. You may not know the answer. The next time you take them, they're going to be telling you the answer because they will have looked it up and they will catch on. And nature will do what it always does. It fills your heart. But the other thing you should do for them, take them to museums, take them to concerts, take them to art galleries, because kids are not dumb. And very quickly they realize, they'll know that nature is suffering right now because humanity has put this one species. I mean, right now we take up over nearly half the land just to feed one species ourselves. They will know that there's an environmental crisis and that human activity is the cause. And you don't want them to hate humans. You don't want them to become cynical little misanthropes. So if they get to love the arts too, they will get to love the beauty of human expression, and they will want to be a beautiful, expressive person themselves.
Mm.
You do that to a kid at an early age, and it works. It worked for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. If you were given a blank check, unlimited funding for any project or projects up to 3, what would you use the money for?
I would put solar panels on every available roof all over the world. I mean, they're doing solar energy in Norway. We can do it here. That would make such a difference. We wouldn't have to burn things to get the energy that we have become addicted to and accustomed to. I think addicted was actually the right verb.
Yeah, that was said a couple of times in the book, and I've been pondering that, and I think you're right. The addict kind of knows that it's maybe not the best thing for them, but they can't stop.
Yeah.
It's kind of where
And
we're at.
and even use it in terms of food. I mean, obviously every species in that sense was addicted to food, so you can't really call it an addiction. But I also explain that the way that we grow our food now is that we have addicted our soil to these chemicals that as the quality of the soil depletes, it keeps needing more and more. It's just like a junkie's body.
I'm excited to ask you this one. We've already told quite a few stories today, and I know when I emailed you with these preparatory questions, you were like, I have a million. But what is one of your favorite field story or stories to tell? And it could just be the most amazing day on the field or on a trip, or it could be a day where things happened and it just makes a really great story now.
Only one? I mean,
You can
I
do a
did
couple.
mention to you, that I did, for research purposes, of course, have to eat one of those 3 Michelin star seafood
Meals.
meals that Chef Angel prepares. And I got to go to the biggest tiger preserve and mangrove forest in the world. But I think I'm going to tell you one that I didn't mention before. On the Mesoamerican reef, at one point in the Yucatan Peninsula, I paused at a little seaside town called Chicxulub. And Chicxulub is the place where 66 million years ago, this asteroid came hurtling down through space and it smashed into this planet. Chicxulub was underwater at the time, but it made such a splash and spread so much hell and brimstone that 3/4 of all species vanished. And that included all these enormous reptiles that for 106 million years ago had held sway on this planet. I mean, compare that to, our paltry, couple 100,000 years as Homo sapiens. But among the survivors, it turns out that not every dinosaur died because there were some small feathered ones that made it through. Probably they nested in the ground and just dug in underground. Uh, and you probably heard them singing to you today. They're still here with us. They are survivors of the last major extinction event. And there was also a little shrew-like animal. There's a little vertebrate called Purgatorius. And that's our ancestor, yours and mine, because into that huge dinosaur-sized niche, mammals flowed in and evolved. And here we are today, and with luck, we can still be survivors too. But we're going to have to do a lot of things right. And in my book, you meet lots of people who are showing us how to do it right, and they don't quit. And that's just wonderful.
Absolutely. At the end of each episode, I like to leave the audience with a conservation ask to go forth and bring into the world or go do. What would you like my audience to take from your episode today?
Well, I already mentioned one of them, and that's what to do with these children. We have to nurture a love for nature and a love for the best of human nature, in all of them. But another one, and I'm speaking, specifically to my fellow citizens of the United States. We're in a war right now. There's no other way to put it. And it's in a war for our spirits and our souls and our freedom in the best sense of the word. Not just freedom to do business, as it's often interpreted, but freedom to do whatever you choose to do as long as it's not something harmful to someone else. And right now, we need to get out there. Nearly everybody who's listening to this, I'm, and I'm accepting some of the people who immigrated here from other countries. Nearly everybody in the United States grew up in this placid post-war time where all we ever knew was that kind of freedom in the best sense. Maybe we were part of a racial minority that had to struggle harder for it, but still, more breathing space here. That's why so many people, even from countries where we have perpetrated wars like Central America, those people want to come here or have wanted to come here. We have to keep it that way, which means we can't take it easy anymore. We've got to get out into the streets. We have to protest. We have to get into our elected officials' faces. We either do it the way that I do it. I'm writing a lot of op-eds right now. Or we show up in their town halls, we show up in Congress, we show up in the state legislature, and we scream truth to power. There's a wonderful group that I follow that's in Hope Dies Last called Climate Defiance. They are self-described nerds, queers, dweebs, just these people who you would look at them and you would think there's no strength. They're some of the most powerful, resilient, stubborn people I've ever met. And they show up. I follow them to watch them literally take down the CEO of Bank of America, which was one of the biggest investors in fossil fuels. They ran him off the stage, and they do that to politicians. And now, even during the Trump administration, they're still doing it. They're getting thrown in jail and beaten. They won't quit because their future is on the line. Their future is going to be fried. And that's what they tell these people. And that's what we have to tell them.
Thank you. The audience wants to find you, connect with you, learn more about you or your work. Where's the best place to do so? And buy your book.
Well, buying my book is easy because it's on sale everywhere. Hope Dies Last. It's one of those titles that's kind of hard to forget. You can find more about me. I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit journalism collective. Like all nonprofits and like all journalists, we are now fighting for our existence, but we are still here. And it's easy to remember. Homelands, that's Homelands plural, and you click up on team and you'll find my name and you'll find a bio and a list of a lot of my writings and stuff that you can read there, or all my books. We're a collective, and that's been part of my strength, working with other people. So I've never bothered to put up my own website. Writing can get really lonely. I'm grateful to be blessed with wonderful colleagues.
Perfect. Well, I'll put a link to your Homelands website, and the link to your book and everything else kind of chatted about in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much, Cara. What a great conversation. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for listening to today's show. I'd love to hear any insight you've gleaned. Leave a comment in the show notes or send me an email over at karagracemuzia.com. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and, of course, share with your friends. If you want more resources for creating a life of purpose and meaning, plus personal insight from me that I just don't share anywhere else, join me at karagracemuzia.com and sign up for email updates. Keep after your dreams and making waves in your community. One person can make a difference. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast.